Good morning, and thank you all for coming here. I have just had a meeting with the mayor of Newport and the reps and senators from Aquidneck Island to review the findings of the DPUC report from last year's outage in Newport. And I'll offer a few words, and then I'll turn it over to the mayor, and I think a few of the reps and senators want to offer a few comments as well. So a few things that we all agree on. What happened last year in Newport was unacceptable, and National Grid bears some of the responsibility for that because they weren't prepared. Enbridge also bears some of the responsibility for that because we now know that they misprogrammed a valve. And what I know to be true, and what I feel firmly about, is that the ratepayers in the state of Rhode Island will not and should not have to bear the cost for their mistakes. And that is something that I feel I can speak for everybody here in saying. The fact of the matter is, look, as we say, there was a perfect storm last year. Everything came together. It was unusually cold temperature, an unusually large drop from a warm temperature to an incredibly cold temperature. The Fields Point facility in Providence malfunctioned, and there was an improperly programmed valve on the Algonquin line, which Enbridge controls. All of that being said, these things, cold temperatures we need to be prepared for. It's going to happen again. Aging infrastructure exists. So I have directed the DPUC to work with National Grid to put a plan in place and begin to enact that plan to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and to give us some certainty that this won't happen again. The people of Aquidneck Island, the people of Rhode Island, deserve affordable, reliable, resilient energy and electricity, regardless of the temperature, regardless of the time of year. That's what people expect, pay for, and deserve. I will say my frustration and disappointment with National Grid is directed at their management team and not the men and women who are on the ground, who we see out there working hard in tough conditions in the bucket trucks. And I want to clarify that. I know sometimes when I say this, folks on the ground feel the weight of what I'm saying. It's not directed at them. Frankly, they're the ones who are in harm's way and were in harm's way last winter in the freezing cold temperatures. It's the decisions being made above them, or lack of decisions, or lack of willingness to make the necessary investments in this infrastructure. I wanted to meet with the entire delegation from the State House, first of all, because we lived this together and they were fantastic and they've continued to live it with their constituents on the ground. But second of all, because we need to put more teeth into what the Department of Public Utilities is allowed to do as it relates to grid. In Massachusetts, the DPUC can fine National Grid, and I believe would fine National Grid in a circumstance like this. Same thing in New York. In Rhode Island, we're not allowed to do that. You know what that means? That means if there were the same emergency that happened in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the grid trucks are going to Massachusetts because they know they can be fined there. So I'm asking the legislature, I asked the legislature last year, I'm asking them again this year, give the folks of Rhode Island the same rights and chances of the people in Massachusetts, New York, and other states. Give the Department of Public Utilities the tools that it needs in order to hold grid accountable. The department right now is working with Grid to put in place an emergency preparedness plan and a plan to get us through the winter and beyond. We need some more tools in the toolbox in order to enforce this on Grid so we can hold them accountable to do what they need to do for the people of Rhode Island, and to make certain that ratepayers don't pay for Grid's mistakes. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Bova, and then I will be back and happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you for calling this press conference and allowing me to speak. I also want to acknowledge the General Assembly members behind me and for being here and for being there in January when we were struggling with this outage. As I'm sure many of you remember, when we first got word from National Grid that gas was going to be cut off from thousands of Newport homes, it was the coldest night of the year. It was 4 degrees. And our residents and businesses went a week without heat, leading to substantial costs and damages, some of which still have not been repaid. And I was glad to read the report from the PUC, but I was frustrated by how clear it was that the incident could have been prevented, but that if the distribution system had been better managed, the consequences would have been much less severe. Numerous management errors and system vulnerabilities were found by the report, and it also highlighted a number of recommendations for improvement that on the city side, and I'm sure on the state side, we will continue to push for because they are very important to help ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. And that really brings me to an issue that the governor touched on before, that the hardest thing I had to do during the gas outage was to look my constituents, my residents in the eye and tell them how limited the state is in its ability to hold National Grid accountable. And as I said before, I'm still hearing from folks who have not been paid. And I share their frustration, and it is unacceptable. So I'm joining the governor in pushing for the General Assembly to pass the legislation that will allow us to fine our utility companies, fine National Grid, and enforce them to put in emergency plans. So if they don't follow those, we can actually hold them accountable and there will be consequences. That is, like I said, it was the hardest thing to look someone in the eye as they go for a week without heat, as their pipes burst because it's 4 degrees outside, and tell them, can't find them. So that's, to take away from this, it's the most important thing to take away. And I also do want to hand it over to any members of the General Assembly if they have any statements or comments that they would like to make.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Governor. As we indicated, it was a fateful day on January 21st when the situation occurred. And having talked with the leaders of Enbridge and the leaders of National Grid, the situation can clearly happen again. It categorically can happen again. We need to do what we need to do in the short term, but we need to look at this from a long-term perspective to have a resilient and reliable gas and electricity transmission and distribution system. I'm proud to stand here today. I think by the end of November, there's a Senate commission that will been stood up, legislation that was passed last session, to actually look at how do we across the state of Rhode Island. Critically here, we have a reliable and resilient gas and electric transmission and distribution system. As the governor indicates, National Grid clearly at fault, Enbridge clearly at fault. There are things that could have been done that Enbridge had planned years ago that they didn't move forward with, and it goes right through my district in Tiverton and Little Compton. It's the Senator 70's district in Portsmouth that would have potentially alleviated this problem. With regards to this problem potentially manifesting itself again, more work needs to be done to ensure what happened in Fields Point and what happened at the station in Massachusetts from a computer perspective doesn't happen again. This needs to be happen across the state of Rhode Island so that it's resilient and reliable so that when 4 degrees happens again, another January 21st of whatever year, we can handle it. So thank you, Governor, and thank you, Mayor, for hosting us here today.
Thank you, and good morning for being here. Rep. Deb Ruggiero, Middletown and Jamestown. As I gathered with the Governor, and I thank you for organizing this, Governor, and our colleagues, our concerns are this happening again. This wasn't the first incident that happened with National Grid. As you recall, there was a low-pressure incident back in March of 2014, and there still was not a contingency plan. So we want to make sure this doesn't happen again. We also know Grid is talking about putting in a new LNG storage facility temporarily in Portsmouth, but we want to ensure that the cost of that, as well as the cost of the $25 million from this gas outage last January, are not on the backs of the ratepayers. So we are gathered as a group today to ensure that legislation does pass because National Grid should be held accountable. They're held accountable and pay fines in New York, in Massachusetts, and it's unfair for the citizens of Rhode Island to not have that same kind of leverage. So we are going to work together to ensure that we take care of the constituents and the citizens on Aquidneck Island. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Governor.
Thank you all. My name is Dawn Oyer. I'm the state senator representing Newport and Jamestown. So the majority of my constituents were affected last January when the outage happened. I want to thank the governor for convening us and for being a driving force behind legislation that is going to address some shortcomings in our existing legislative and regulatory scheme. I also want to thank Mayor Bova for her leadership on this issue during the entire time of the outage and during the recovery. And I also want to thank my General Assembly colleagues for coming together and supporting the people of Aquidneck Island who are affected by this outage and trying to make sure that we're moving forward with the best foot to protect the entire state of Rhode Island and the ratepayers. As was mentioned, $25 million was the reported cost of this outage. The $25 million does not count the unreimbursed claims that were filed by many of my constituents, both individual citizens and business owners. That's an issue that we all take very seriously, and we have continued to have conversations about how we can try to make those residents and those businesses whole. And unfortunately, the current regulatory and legal scheme provides limited options, but that's something that we need to make sure that we have teeth and we have a process moving forward in case this happens again. The reality is we've heard across the country of different issues with the gas infrastructure. The issue on Aquidneck Island came just on the heels of a tragedy that happened in Massachusetts. This is a fragile system that needs to be regulated, and it needs to be regulated more than it currently is in Rhode Island. So I look forward to working with all of my colleagues to make sure that we get those laws in place to make sure that the regulators can do their job and hold the utilities accountable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming out, ladies and gentlemen. And I would like to thank the governor and her staff for all they've done in terms of making sure that a report got out. The first thing I want to do, though, is to thank all of the Newporters who, the generosity during that time was unbelievable. I know we're talking government stuff here, but there were so many individuals in this state, both corporate, labor, individuals, companies, who came forth and helped out really fast to get people who were affected, folks who were standing out in the cold with no place to go, nothing to eat. They came and helped. So this is the first time publicly I've had a chance to thank those people for doing that. But the second thing is that now we have a document from which we can start to work and we can start to plan and make sure that this, as my colleagues are saying, does not happen again. All of us wanted to have quick answers at the time, but that was almost impossible. But we've been assured by the governor that her staff has the expertise to read this report, to understand what it means, and to help us understand how we can then go back and talk to our colleagues and our constituents in order to pass something that works. There is a process through which a bill is passed, and it goes through committees in both the House and the Senate. And as much as all of us would like something to happen instantaneously, we do have to make sure we go through the process, and now we have a document from which we can do that. So I thank you so much for you and your staff being so meticulous in making sure that we got that information, and the hard work starts now so that, as Senator DePalma was saying, that this does not happen again. But thanks to everyone who's here and all of those really who helped at a real tough time get Newporters through that situation. Thanks again.
Chairman, why didn't this pass the last session?
Well, that's a great question. We have a lot of bills. One of the reasons was that there was no legislation was there, but there was no underlining report from my perspective, at least. Now we have that. We have documentation of what really happened before. We probably would have been guessing, or our best guess had happened. And that, in my opinion, is not a way to try to put legislation together that's going to affect us from time out. So we now have a document from which we can look at it.
This report is strong enough to underpin the passage of the bill?
I think it goes a long way in helping that out. You know, you never know. That's why it's so critical that all of us really read it, and the governor has also said that, you know, her staff would help us understand that, because we do have to, in our case, we have to convince, well, in my case, 74 other people, and in Senator DePalma's, you know, 37 other people. So it's not like we can say that today it's going to happen, but we know it's important, and we want it to happen, but we didn't have an underlying document that would put us on the path to doing that, and we have that now. So I think that's going to be helpful. Oh, I don't disagree with what you're saying. You know, I'm just saying that in order to get something through a process, I believe you have to have an underlying document to do that in this particular case. Because as it is, there are still people now who, you know, have not, in some cases, been reimbursed for some of the expenses that they think would due to this. So now we have something we can put our teeth into, and I can use that, all of us can, to try and convince our other colleagues that this is something that we should do. And of course, anytime, you have to make sure the legislation says what it needs to say to get to the point of putting leverage on National Grid or any company to do that. So.
And this mirrors the legislation that didn't before last year. And
It does to a degree. I'm just, remember now, the report just came out, and so I'm just reading it, so I don't know word for word what it mirrors, but I think from what I can remember, it really does. I'd have to refresh myself on that.
if I remember the report, a fine was levied, a $40,000 fine was levied against National Grid for violation of communication. Notification. Okay, notification. So can you maybe clarify the difference between the fines that the state and the municipality will be able to levy versus the fine that the DQC is levying?
Yeah. So the legislation that I put forth last year really mirrors Massachusetts and New York. And it requires, number one, that Grid would have to give us in advance an emergency preparedness plan and preparedness plans that they would have to file with the department. And it would have to have certain specifications met. So it would have to be complete, comprehensive, and filed with the department to our satisfaction. On an annual basis. Right now, they don't have to do that. And it's hard for us to enforce it because they don't have to. Secondarily, you know, Massachusetts, it's not uncommon for there to be multi-million-dollar fines for different categories of mistakes or negligence on behalf of Grid. And so it's a matter, you know, it's magnitude, candidly, and category. And it's kind of to what Bill said, like the legislation I put forth, and I'm willing to work with them to make changes, was very much a carbon copy of Massachusetts, which I think is relevant. Because when I'm on the phone with the executives of Grid saying, we matter as much as Massachusetts, the truth of it is, the governor of Massachusetts just has more tools in his toolbox to enforce Grid to do what they're supposed to do.
So what did the fine that you see kind of fall under? Am I mistaken in that?
Right now, we don't really have, DPUC doesn't really have an ability. Like, right here, you heard they made mistakes at Fields Point, they made mistakes by not having backups for LNG. We have no ability to, first of all, we didn't have the plan ahead of time filed, and then there's no process in place to find them for those mistakes. I do. I'll be very candid. I do. You know, they'll take the meeting. They will act. Certainly, last year they had battalions of people here almost immediately. But no, and it's not as much. It's not as good as it would be if I were to say, and if you don't, these are the consequences. So, I think blowing me off is strong. And I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. I think that I would have their attention more, and they would act with more speed and focus if there were a penalty. I do.
Was National Grid represented in your meetings?
No, they weren't here. I was just, you have to remember, I lived this with these guys. They were on the ground then. They've been on the ground every day since. They're incredibly diligent, and as a you know, as a matter of good government, I wanted to talk to them.
The report says there was no capacity fund, and yet it also suggests that we increase capacity despite actual size.
Yeah.
To the initial program pipeline, and I was wondering where that came from. Doesn't seem to be indicated in the report.
Yeah, I don't know, and I think as Senator DePalma said it, these are there's the immediate issue, how are we going to get through this winter? And then there are the longer term issues of capacity, infrastructure, affordability, resilience, and we have to get to the bottom of all of that. I don't think it should.
I've never seen a pipeline built that doesn't fall in.
Yeah, fair enough. It's premature for me to answer that, but that is exactly what we need to dig into.
Okay, time for two more questions. In terms of long-term issues, at what point are there diminishing returns
Yeah.
to the investment in the infrastructure of this type, especially when it comes to the island and the grading of the infrastructure, I mean, in Rhode Island generally, but specifically Aquidneck Island, the climate change goals that the state has, the municipality may have?
Yeah. So look, that's a better question for GRID. It's my position that they should do whatever it takes to make sure that the people of Rhode Island have affordable, reliable energy and electricity, even on the coldest day of the year. Especially on the coldest day of the year. Exactly, especially on the coldest day of the year. Now, to answer the point you were getting at, they might say, there's not as much incentive for us to invest because, you know, hopefully we'll be fully away from natural gas at some point in the relatively near future. This is aging infrastructure. Why should we invest? And my answer to that is because it is the right thing to do. This is a utility. I understand you're in business to make money. You have an obligation to provide these services to the people of Rhode Island, and we want to hold you accountable to do that.
Is there anyone among you in this group that harbors a fear that this is going to happen again this winter?
We all do. Well, I didn't speak to you, but of course we all do. That's why we're here. That's why we're meeting. That's why my team is meeting with GRID. I mean, we're going to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't, and we're certainly going to make sure that the mistakes they made last year will not happen again this year. But I don't think we'd be so focused on it if we weren't somewhat worried.
Last question.
Can you tell me a little bit about the unreimbursed claims that were brought up several times? How much money are we actually talking?
Yeah, I'll let them.
We don't know.
I'll,
We don't know.
I'll let the mayor speak to that, and then I'll give you my answer.
Yeah, I don't know how much it has been. I mean, I haven't totaled all the people who have spoken to me, and I don't know if all of the people who have spoken to me have also spoken to the other reps and senators. I suspect that there's some overlap, but there's also probably people who have spoken to them and not me. But it's not insignificant.
We don't know. So,
I don't know.
here's the thing. One of the other reasons that I came down here to have this private meeting is because they're on the ground every day, and I get the ground truth when they're talking to people. And I have to say, until I talked to them today, I didn't realize that the local officials are still hearing from a lot of people. So I've asked them to help me try to compile, are we talking about tens of people, dozens of people, hundreds of people? What kinds of claims? Are these claims that GRID said that they would pay for and now they're not paying for? I will say there was a lot of miscommunication when it was happening. So what I can tell you is I'm gonna work with them to see if I can get a compilation of these complaints and see how much they total and what we can do about it. But the honest answer today is we don't know. It's very ad hoc. People call reps and senators on a one-by-one basis, and we'll have to try to get it all together. I have not, because I literally am just hearing about it this morning. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It depends. I don't know. It depends on the nature of the claims, but probably not.
Thank you.
Probably not.